The crowd gasped. The arrogant tourist tickled the guardsman, but in the very next second, a rifle with a bayonet shot up, threateningly aimed at his chest. Bob's drunken laughter stopped, and something no one expected appeared on his face: fear. What happened next shocked everyone. But let's start from the very beginning. Buckingham Palace, the heart of royal power, stood tall against the overcast London sky. Silvery beams of sunlight pierced through the clouds, casting light on the perfectly manicured lawns, the imposing black iron gates, and the main attraction for tourists, the motionless guards in their crimson uniforms. A crowd had gathered at the gates, accustomed to the sight yet still unable to look away. People filmed every movement, hoping to capture the rare moment when one of these living statues would so much as flinch. Among the sea of tourists, one man stood out. A sunburned, overweight American who looked like he had already had more to drink than he should have. His face was flushed from alcohol and heat. Beads of sweat covered his forehead, making his greasy bangs stick to his skin. His Hawaiian shirt, bright blue with red flowers, hung loosely on his massive frame, completely unbuttoned, exposing his sagging beer belly, blotched with sunburn. A cheap gold chain dangled from his neck, and in his right hand he clutched a plastic cup filled with what was now lukewarm beer, lazily sipping it in small gulps. His name was Bob. Bob swayed on his feet, smirking, radiating the cocky confidence of a drunk tourist who thought he owned the world. "Come on, they're just actors," he muttered, taking one last swig of beer. The crowd around him kept filming, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. People whispered among themselves. "Is he about to do something? Oh God, this is going to be embarrassing." But Bob wasn't listening. A brilliant idea. His drunken gaze landed on the guardsman standing directly in front of him. A young Brit, fair-skinned, with a perfectly clean-shaven face, staring straight ahead without the slightest sign of life. His posture was perfect, his spine as straight as a drawn bowstring, his hands firmly gripping his rifle, bayonet gleaming under the dim light. Bob squinted at him. Then a slow grin spread across his face. "10 quid says this guy won't even blink," he bellowed, jabbing his elbow into his friend Jack. Jack, another American tourist, grimaced. Tall and fit, dressed in jeans and a tank top with the American flag, he was already regretting coming out with Bob. "Dude, maybe don't," he muttered, glancing at the security officers nearby. But Bob wasn't listening. He was on a roll. A fatal mistake. Spreading his feet wide, he swayed forward, his bare chest rising and falling with his belly. "All right, soldier boy," he slurred, leaning in, his hot, beer-soaked breath washing over the crisp uniform of the British guardsman. "Let's see if you're even alive." The crowd fell silent. Someone inhaled sharply. The guardsman didn't blink. Bob grinned. And before anyone could stop him, before Jack could grab his sleeve, before the security could step in, Bob spread his thick fingers and... tickling. He slowly ran his fingers under the guardsman's arm. Once, twice, 3 times. No reaction. What happened next stunned everyone. The guardsman, who had been as motionless as a stone statue just a second ago, suddenly stirred. The guardsman's first reaction. A sharp inhale. Clenched teeth. With military precision, he took a step back. His heavy black boot slammed against the pavement with a resounding thud that echoed through the chests of everyone nearby. In the dead silence of the square, the sound was deafening, like thunder splitting the sky. "Step back!" A commanding voice rang out, sharp, authoritative. Someone in the crowd shrieked, and a group of Chinese tourists instinctively shuffled backward, nearly knocking over a street vendor's stand. but not Bob. A mad mistake. The drunken fool just laughed, loud, obnoxious, like a man too blind to see how close he was to disaster. "Whoa, no way!" He slapped his knee, his massive belly jiggling. "So, you're not a robot, huh?" He leaned in closer, shoving his booze-stained face toward the Brit. "Come on, do something else." And again, another fatal move. Bob reached out, trying to pat the guardsman's shoulder. The guardsman waits no longer. At that moment, everything changed. Without a fraction of hesitation, the British guardsman snapped his rifle upward. The black polished wood flashed in the sunlight. The deadly bayonet was now aimed directly at Bob's chest. The crowd gasped. Cameras zoomed in. Time froze. "Step back immediately!" The guardsman's voice thundered across the square, slicing through the air like a hot blade. Bob froze. His fat hand stopped mid-air, inches away from the uniform. Sudden realization. His drunken smile vanished. His mouth hung open, but no words came out. For the first time that day, fear flickered in his eyes. He understood. This was not an attraction. This was not a show. The man in front of him was ready to skewer him through if he took one more step. A second ago, Bob was convinced he was in control. He was the star of the day. The funny guy who could mess with this wooden soldier and walk away laughing. But now, standing face to face with a bayonet, he felt something cold crawl down his spine. The first attempt to save face. Bob quickly raised his hands, fingers trembling. "Hey man, take it easy. I was just joking." His voice cracked into a nervous chuckle. But no one was laughing. The crowd no longer saw him as a funny tourist. His laughter clashed against the dead silence that hung over the square. Instead of laughter, voices of disapproval began to murmur. "How disgraceful," an elderly British woman in an elegant hat muttered, shaking her head. "Of course, an American." A man in a dark suit grumbled, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "That's just too much," someone said behind him, and there wasn't a hint of sympathy in their voice. The guardsman remains unmoved. The guardsman did not budge. His hand still gripped the rifle. His gaze was vacant and unyielding, as if he were looking through the tourist, like dirt on the road. Bob felt something tighten in his chest. Heat crept up his neck. Fear set in. The final humiliation. His legs failed him. Everything spun. Dark spots clouded his vision. His body swayed forward. "Oh, crap," he muttered, trying to steady himself. But he couldn't. His body lurched forward. Belly hit the pavement first. Then his hands. Then his face. Splat. A dirty puddle exploded beneath him. His open shirt soaked up the filth. His chain vanished between his fat rolls, and his face was now covered in grime and cigarette butts. For a moment, everything was still. The crowd burst into laughter. "Now that was worth it!" someone shouted. The crowd first gasped, then erupted in laughter. Britain doesn't like tourists who disrespect its traditions. But Britain loves watching those tourists fall flat on their faces. "How's that for a win?" a guy in glasses yelled, filming the scene. Laughter, cameras, mockery, and that stench, that disgusting mix of dirty water and stale beer soaking into his clothes. Bob tried to push himself up, but his hands slipped, and he face-planted back into the puddle. The crowd applauded. But the worst for Bob was yet to come. Bob lay in the dirt, soaked, humiliated, covered in street dust and puddle water. The crowd was still laughing. Some were filming, while others were already uploading the video to TikTok with captions like, "Dumb tourist messes with guardsman. The ending is epic." But Bob was too drunk to grasp the full scale of his disaster. He tried to get up, his hands trembling, his legs wobbling like rubber, but before he could stand, a voice froze him in place. "You are under arrest for assaulting a military officer." That voice hit like a thunderclap. Total panic. Bob lifted his head, blinking, trying to focus. Standing before him was a Royal Guard officer, black uniform, cold stare, white gloves gripping a radio. This officer was not joking. Bob's eyes widened. "What?" He jerked up, sending water splashing from his shirt. The crowd went silent. "You've got to be kidding me. This is just a joke." Bob's voice wavered, but the officer didn't even blink. Handcuffs and screaming. The next second, 2 police officers grabbed him by the arms. Huge, strong British cops lifted him effortlessly, like a rag doll. "You have the right to remain silent," one of them began, his voice calm and rehearsed. Bob panicked. His face turned beet red, his arms flailed, but the officers held him tight. "You guys are insane." He shook with terror as the metal click of handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. The final nail in the coffin. The crowd watched in silence. Brits nodded approvingly. Tourists eagerly filmed. Bob was the center of attention, but not the way he wanted. And just as the officers began leading him away, the final blow landed. "Well, buddy, looks like you just won that 10 pounds. Bob snapped his head around. Jack, his so-called friend, standing there, smirking, casually slipping his phone into his pocket. Bob froze, his eyes filling with a mix of rage and horror. But Jack had already turned away, disappearing into the crowd. The Guardsman remains unshaken. As Bob was dragged away, the Guardsman never moved. He simply stepped back into formation. As if nothing had happened. His hands gripped his rifle. His face remained blank. The crowd slowly dispersed. Life returned to normal. But for Bob, this day was far from over. At that moment, as Bob was being hauled off, he probably still thought he could get away with it. Maybe a fine, maybe a short interrogation. But he had no idea that a completely different kind of punishment awaited him. One he could never escape. How the internet made him a joke. The second Bob tickled the Guardsman became instant meme material. Slow-motion replays, dramatic zoom-ins, fail sound effects, and the classic loser movie music. His downfall was everywhere. Major social media channels picked it up. Watch this idiot ruin his own vacation forever. This is why Guardsmen aren't your friends. This tourist thought he could tickle a British Guardsman. His mistake cost him everything. Some broke down the video frame by frame, analyzing exactly where Bob made the irreversible mistake. Others turned it into a challenge, recreating the moment with their own friends dressed as Guardsmen. The hashtag #TickleFail exploded on Twitter. Within 24 hours, Bob's video was the #1 trending clip in the world. How fame found Bob, but the worst was yet to come. When Bob was finally released, he turned on his phone, unaware that his life had changed forever. 50+ missed calls, 1,000+ new messages, 100+ social media mentions. His Facebook page was flooded with comments. "Dude, is this really you? This is the best thing I've ever seen. How does it feel to be the dumbest tourist in history? Congrats, you're famous in Japan now." His WhatsApp was packed with voice messages. "Bro, you're in the news. No, seriously, you're in every news outlet. Dude, I can't stop laughing. You're a legend." The final blow, a lifetime ban from the UK. But the worst moment came 3 days later. A new email popped up in his inbox. Subject, Notice of entry ban to the United Kingdom. Bob opened it. In plain black and white it read, "You have been deemed a person who engaged in behavior incompatible with public order and safety in the United Kingdom. As a result, you are permanently banned from entering the country." Bob couldn't believe his eyes. "What the hell?" he muttered, rubbing his face with his dirty hand. But it was real. "Too stupid to cross the border," someone tweeted. "Guardsman, 1. Americans, 0, joked another. "British law is brutal, but fair," wrote a third. The end of a story. The birth of a legend. From that moment on, Bob's name was etched into internet history. He was no longer just a tourist. He was now, officially, the dumbest tourist who ever tried to tickle a guardsman and got banned for life.